The air in Massachusetts in the winter of 1774 carried a silence that felt unnatural. Snow softened the roads and muffled the sound of passing carts, but beneath that calm lay the beating heart of rebellion. Boston had been scarred by unrest, and the countryside was a hive of rumors, whispers, and half-seen movements at night. At the center of this quiet storm stood a tavern, an old wooden structure with smoke-blackened beams, low ceilings, and the smell of ale and tobacco woven into its walls. To an ordinary traveler, it was a place for warmth and food, a respite from the bitter cold. But for those who knew, the tavern served another purpose. It was a sanctuary for secret messages, a gathering point where loyalty was tested not by words alone, but by the courage to act. The innkeeper, Master Whitfield, seemed like any weary man past his prime, his hands calloused, his back bent from years of labor. Few suspected that his ink-stained ledger was more than a record of debts. In the margins of that book, hidden between numbers and names, lay coded notes passed from one patriot to another. A careless glance would reveal nothing more than tavern business, but those trained in the cipher could read the calls for arms, the warnings of British troop movements, and the locations of hidden stores of powder. On one bitter night, a group of farmers sat huddled by the fire, mugs of ale in their hands, speaking of the harvest. Yet their eyes shifted too often toward the door, their voices dropping when strangers entered. In the corner, young Samuel Browne, a farm boy scarcely 20, sat apart. His father had fought in the French and Indian War, and though Samuel had never seen true battle, his blood ran hot with the need to resist. The fear of the crown's soldiers weighed on him. But so too did the conviction that freedom was worth the risk. As the tavern's door creaked open, a gust of icy air swept in, followed by a man in a heavy cloak. His boots carried the mud of distant roads, and his eyes flickered cautiously before settling on Whitfield. Without a word, the innkeeper poured him a drink and set it down on the table near the window. The man removed his glove, reached into his coat, and placed a folded scrap of paper beneath the mug. Samuel's heart pounded. He had been told of this practice, of coded messages left in plain sight. Every patriot knew the risk. The British Army had spies, loyalists eager to report treasonous talk, and soldiers quick to punish. Yet in that small action, a folded note slipped across a tavern table, lay the spark of something greater. Later that night, when the tavern had thinned and only the trusted remained, Whitfield carefully retrieved the scrap. The men around him grew silent, their breaths visible in the cold air. He read the words, his brow furrowing. Troops will march from Boston by the week's end. Concord is their aim. The stores must be moved. A shiver passed through the room. Concord, where powder, muskets, and cannon lay hidden. If the British seized them, the colonists' hope of armed resistance would vanish before it truly began. Samuel clenched his fists. His youth urged him to action, yet fear crept like frost into his chest. Could farmers and blacksmiths stand against trained redcoats? Could whispers in taverns become a war for independence? The fire crackled, casting long shadows on the wall, and in those flickering shapes, he saw both the weight of danger and the glimmer of destiny. That night, sleep eluded them all. For beyond the creak of the tavern walls, beyond the wind against the shutters, they knew the world was changing, and once the first shot was fired, there would be no return. By dawn, word had spread beyond the tavern. Riders moved swiftly along frozen paths, delivering fragments of the message to trusted households. Each man carried the news as though it were a torch, fragile, dangerous, but necessary to pass before darkness claimed it. Samuel rode with 2 others, his breath freezing in the air as his horse's hooves struck the icy road. The villages they passed were subdued, yet in the eyes of farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers, a quiet resolve glimmered. Men paused in their work to listen, to nod, to silently shoulder muskets that had been hidden in barns for months. When they returned to the tavern, the mood was tense. Maps lay spread across the wooden tables, their corners held down with mugs and knives. Candles burned low, dripping wax like frozen tears, while men argued in hushed but urgent tones. "We cannot meet them head-on," one warned. "Our numbers are too few." Another countered, "If we scatter, they'll take everything without a fight." Samuel stood back, listening, absorbing the fear and determination in equal measure. His own voice trembled when he finally spoke. "What if we strike them before they reach Concord? Not in open field, but on the roads, from the woods. Force them to know this land belongs to us." The room grew quiet. Some scoffed at the idea of ambush, calling it dishonorable, unfit for gentlemen. But others nodded, recognizing the truth. This was not a war of equals, but of survival. They had no choice but to fight with shadows, to use the land itself as a weapon. That evening, Samuel found himself alone outside, the cold seeping through his coat. He gazed at the pale winter sky, where stars flickered faintly. He thought of his mother, of the warmth of his home, and of the uncertain path ahead. Would he live to see the independence they whispered of? Or would his name be buried beneath snow and silence? The tavern door opened, and Whitfield stepped out, his face grave. "Samuel," he said softly, "you remind me of your father. He once stood where you do now, on the edge of a choice. The burden of freedom is heavy, boy, but it falls to those willing to carry it." Samuel swallowed hard, the weight of those words pressing upon him. In the distance, a wolf's howl broke the night, echoing across the fields like an omen. The time for hesitation was gone. 2 nights later, another message arrived, slipped beneath a mug just as before. This time, the words were harsher, colder. "Beware. Loyalists watch the tavern. Trust no stranger." Paranoia set in. Every unfamiliar face became a threat. Every creak of the tavern floorboards, a possible betrayal. Still, they pressed on. Powder was hidden deeper, wagons moved by night, and signals arranged with lanterns across the hills. Yet with every precaution came the haunting knowledge that one careless word, one spy's report, could undo them all. The tavern, once a place of warmth, now seemed cloaked in unease. Laughter was rare, voices dropped to whispers, and men kept their hands close to their knives. Still, amid the fear, there was something unshakable: resolve. For the men who gathered there had already chosen their path. The road to Concord awaited, and with it, the first clash of a war not yet declared, but already burning in their hearts. The final days before the march were the longest. Snow began to melt, leaving the roads slick with mud. Horses struggled, wheels sank, and the land itself seemed reluctant to let go of winter. But spring was coming, and with it, the promise of fire. Inside the tavern, the men gathered one last time. Candles lit their faces, their shadows looming tall on the timber walls. Whitfield read aloud the newest intelligence. "The king's troops prepare. They march soon. Their numbers are many." Silence followed. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the faint rattle of wind against the shutters. Samuel felt his chest tighten. Fear was no longer an enemy to overcome. It was a companion, riding with them into the unknown. A plan took shape, or not of bravado, but of necessity. Scouts would ride ahead. Men would gather along the roads, hidden in trees and stone walls. Farmers would trade plows for muskets, their fields becoming battlegrounds. and when the redcoats advanced, they would find not open defiance, but a storm of shots from the shadows. The night before they departed, Samuel sat by the fire, quill in hand, writing by flickering light. His words were simple, written to his mother. "If I do not return, know that I stood for something greater than myself. Know that I did not bow. Whatever fate finds me, it will find me free." He folded the letter and slipped it into his coat. He prayed she would never need to read it. At dawn, the tavern emptied. Men mounted horses, others took to the road on foot. Muskets slung across their shoulders. Samuel looked back once at the weathered sign swinging above the door. It creaked in the wind, as though bidding farewell. The tavern had been their refuge, their council chamber, their place of secrets. Now it stood as a silent witness to history. As they rode toward Concord, the air was heavy with anticipation. Every sound, the crack of a twig, the distant call of a bird, seemed sharper, laden with meaning. Samuel's heart beat like a drum in his chest. And then, as dawn broke fully, the first shots rang out, not far away, but close enough to shatter the morning calm. Men froze, breath caught in their throats. The war had begun, though none could yet see how far it would stretch, how much it would cost. Samuel gripped his musket tighter, his knuckles white. He thought of the tavern, of the coded messages, of the whispers in the dark that had brought them here. Every choice, every risk had led to this moment. The battle awaited. The story of a nation was about to be written, not in ink upon tavern ledgers, but in blood and sacrifice upon the fields of Massachusetts. And as Samuel stepped forward into the fog of war, one truth burned brighter than all others. There was no turning back.